Live, eh? So if you see me looking up, it's because the live chat or the everything in live chat is up here because I have a TV that a friend gave me. Really good friend, she's amazing. I have a TV she gave me, and my camera is right here because it's a MacBook, and MacBook is ass with its camera quality and mic quality, and you may hear a fan because it's hot and my room's AC is bad, and also gamer lights that you can't see because I have to turn off this light to show it. And you can still can't see it turning them off. Anyway, schizo ranting aside. Hi, I'm Sai, and today this is going to be a weird video. So I got this first off, I got this new sketchbook. I call it the Tome, specifically Penitence Tome, which is a slight reference to something I call myself. But that aside, I'm going to be talking about an idea I had, basically, as the title says. Last night, technically this morning at like 2 a.m., I got my wisdom teeth out Friday, and I was healing. I healed really fast, and pain went away Tuesday, but off and on pain still continued to the point to where my already messed up sleep schedule was bad. So originally, oxycodone would make me tired, but after like the main 2 days of the pain going away, the oxycodone stopped making me tired and instead mainly made me just really like it didn't make me like awake, but it made me pain meds usually because I already had oral surgery for the tooth to be pulled down. But mainly what happened was pain meds that usually made me tired, they make me also kind of pissy, I'm gonna say. Also, I can see my teeth are yellow. Made me they make me both pissy but also just not caring. So after a while, instead of making me sleepy because it was numbing pain, the pain meds instead just kept me awake longer than I needed to without really any repercussions, especially because I woke up at 6 the next morning to take penicillin because I have to take that every 6 hours, which I already took. I'm going to take it again at like 6 because I screwed up the timing tomorrow. Anyway, essentially, this idea is revolving around a dream slash fever dream thing I had where it was essentially whenever I don't dream often, for context, I don't dream often at all. But whenever I do dream, it tends to be really realistic. The night before, I had a dream that was really weird. It involved old friends, new friends, teachers I used to have, flesh abominations, me being naked and then putting on pants, and it was fine again. I don't know what was going on. But then the next thing, I was not asleep at all, but I was able to jump scare myself repeatedly. But whenever I dream, because I don't dream often, I tend to really enjoy any kind of dream. So if I'm half dreaming, half awake because of a nightmare, I'm usually enjoying the nightmare because I'm able to remember it. At this moment, I remembered an Evangelion looking face. So, specifically, the face of the angel. I think it was the first angel or the third impact angel. I forget what it's called. A friend, someone that I'll send this live stream to afterwards or in the middle of the stream may know the name. She's awesome. She's a school nurse friend of mine. She's amazing. And essentially, it had that kind of face, but it was burly like a gorilla. And all I remember was the face. It had three eyes on its right side. Sorry, I have a hard time on my left or right. I'm actively drawing it. It had three eyes on its right side, and it was just big. Now, when I woke up, I still remembered this part vividly, but I don't remember any specific details. But because I write a lot, I filled in those details myself. What those details ended up being, let me fix this because it kind of does look a little weird. No, I need to fill in the space. Anyway, sorry, side tangent. I ended up filling in those details with another, basically an idea because all right, so I watch a lot of content about anomalies and entities and ARGs. And long story short, I thought of a kind of file series that essentially boils down. God, where did it go? That is not the right Google account. That essentially boils down to an a basically it's a file setting system for someone with the password @ close colon exclamation point close colon capital BI0YOS apostrophe all caps kidneys. That's the password user. It doesn't show a username on purpose. And they're essentially an operator in a sort of SCP / like just liminal space style categorization system that categorizes not just liminal spaces and entities, but also written accounts from specific personnel, SCP style. And this one account, it says, as I wrote, the following archive was written by field specialist Satori Nikolaus and verified by Dr. Enmer Autis, or Auti. Edits are made by Dr. Auti, are annotated as such. I haven't finished written the entire thing, and if I may or may not actually finish it, I'm inconsistent with that. Most of it comes out as thought vomit. And then essentially, the person that I'm just going to call Satori for now, Satori, under the command of Sergeant Kase Hat, which it is spelled KAS set in German E dash capital all caps RAHT. It is intended to be a foreign name, specifically for a foreign species. This sergeant, who I'll just call Sergeant, was the leader of a 5-man team, not counting the sergeant, because in this place, the sergeant is essentially a figurehead rather than actually a sergeant. I also have a Discord chat, completely unrelated to this. Sorry if I keep looking down. The sergeant is a figurehead and kind of the actual military personnel, while everyone else within this 5-man team is sort of just specialists. They have their own specialties. Usually they aren't actually military specialties. Sometimes they are. For example, Satori is recon, because recon was needed for this mission. However, often these specialists are anyone that could be beneficial to the mission. For example, in some specialties, or some specialists are scribes. Some specialists are religious specialists, specifically like priests or rabbis. Some of them are chemists. Some of them are actually drug junkies. Some of them are people who are close to death. It all depends on what is needed by this, not foundation, but this AI that actually runs this organization. It's all that the AI believes would be necessary to search for this. However, this AI is much more benevolent than it seems, as it sends out certain people in hopes that either to survive, or basically either they hope to survive, or if it's an uncharted territory, people who would most likely to survive. Because the AI isn't omnipotent like an AI would be. It's not super intelligent. The AI is adaptive, and it is adaptive in the sense that it is based off of another person. It is not based off of the said researcher who made edits to this post, but it's instead an AI based off of Marcus Manner, who is a basically almost omnipotent wizard in my main lore. It's an AI based off him, but a more benevolent version of him, in hopes of trying to figure out essentially if there is a way to defeat Marcus, but that's a moot point. Essentially, this report from Satori is describing a scene that I created based off that dream. This entire conversation, for however long it's supposed to be, is going to be about that dream. And from what I've written now, I have written as such. Under the command of Sergeant, my team investigated what is called Limb Phenomena 12 paper mache. At the time, no entities were described by subjects, personnel, or key dash initial witnesses. I will stop right there to explain some things. Sorry if it's confusing, but there's a difference between key and initial witnesses, because key is capitalized here. Initial witnesses are people who say, for example, spotted Slenderman, just randomly. Key witnesses are specific people chosen by certain entities to chronicle their initial experience to cause them to live on. Because certain entities choose key witnesses. Say, for example, Dwight D. Eisenhower is a key witness of Bigfoot, or is known as a key witness for Bigfoot, specifically a corpse of Bigfoot, because certain people are chosen to take one look at a specific entity and either kill it or kill that one look of the entity like Bigfoot, or just let it escape and then chronicle it in that moment, and then let society or people around them live on in a new light because this entity is, say, dying or losing its exposure, which is slowly killing it. Because a lot of these entities that, say, for example, Wendigo or Slenderman or Bigfoot, require people to know what they are. But if people stop being creative enough with it, they slowly lose that initial like anomalous aspect of them, and they slowly become their own species via how like the multiverse slowly creates its own entity. Now, key witnesses often don't provide this AI with archives, as key witnesses are either driving themselves insane, die, or haven't reached out enough yet in the multiverse for the AI to find it. However, a key witness by the nickname of Clueless, who runs a Tumblr blog I will create for an ARG called Cluelessly, or I forget what I called it, but Clueless essentially is the Tumblr blogger who has their entire family die because a specific entity doesn't like that they're a key witness. Anyway, that key witness said there were no entities in this specific realm, and no initial witnesses that say stumbled upon it, such as Vincent van Gogh, have mentioned any entities. However, Satori explains, however, my team decided to investigate further within the walls of liminal space. The material the phenomenon was made from was confirmed to be paper mache, and if its layers were peeled back one at a time and slowly, you could expose layers within the phenomena, almost as if they were separate spaces mimicking certain environments and environments found within our world. I will also mention quickly, environments are essentially places where certain animals or animalistic or specific creatures such as alienoid, robotic, humanoid, insectoid, avian, where they exist at their peak. They are the top dog because the environment exists, like that trait is top in that entire system in this world. Because say, for example, all animals need to be able to fly. This place has no land. Then it would be considered an avian environment, and then whatever environment below it, because the environment or the animalistic trait required for that is created because of that environment. All right, and then continuing, found within our environments or environments found within our world, except completely made out of a paper mache like material that had a high tensile strength despite its wet consistency. Or yeah, I should have said consistency. I messed that up. But essentially that's saying that despite it being like paper mache, it is very strong, but still mimics, like still acts as though it is like water, or acts to an extent. I will get into that. Or acts as though it is air. So far, we found 4 environments and 7 environments. An ocean we couldn't explore, a vast jungle, a desert, a city with no ability to harbor life, even our own. And an insectoid, humanoid, amorphous, amphibious, avian, cephalopod, and inorganic environment. Now, to specify I'll specify more about those areas later as I continue on. I don't have much left. However, the jungle was the only part we could explore before we were overrun. The base look of the liminal phenomena is a barren plains that has few tree-like structures. The material is often a slimy gray, ranging in dark to light colors, and even the air casts the world an oil painting-like filter. That's where I stopped writing at that point. Now, to continue, this baseline world of phenomena is often just nicknamed repeatedly by Satori and other members of the squad as just oil painting, because it is not only the most accurate description of it, but it is also the first description given by, as I mentioned earlier, Vincent van Gogh, who found this place through a psychotic break, which, before you question why that was possible, Vincent van Gogh, in the background lore, as well as many other artists such as Francisco Goya and Francis Bacon, as well as Hieronymus Bosch, and even Dante Alighieri from, I forget how to pronounce it, to an extent, they all were able to essentially peek into other worlds through psychotic breaks because they became obsessed with either themselves, their world, or something that manifested into something that other people loved, such as art or writing. Now, going back to that world, Sethori basically they found out that they could peel back the environment on accident when one of their members, who is known for being gluttonous because they embodied the gluttony sin because of the species they were, began to gnaw at the floor because they were just searching for so long, because that was what they were determined. The way the AI finds out if a place is livable or if there's no like active hostility is if the person can find something that they can sustain themselves off of. And the AI sometimes forgets that some creatures don't need to eat, or some creatures eat too much, such as this greed creature. And it is not, this greed creature isn't given a name. It is just nicknamed greed creature because Seitori said that the species doesn't like being named after they die, because often they view death as treason and tragedy rather than something to be honored or just a phenomenon. Anyway, this greed creature slowly peeled back part of a tree, and immediately whenever they saw it, they saw part of an ocean, what looked like an ocean. This is when the greed creature died, because the ocean, while it still functions like an ocean, and there were creatures in this ocean, which I will get to soon, as soon as you get into this, because those creatures were not meant to actually, or because Seitori and other people in the squad were not meant to be in this world, when they crossed into the more ocean-like place, the pressure of each compressed layer immediately killed them and made them a prime target for what's called a flatfish, flatfish plaster cast. I think I called it plaster cast. Yeah, plaster caster, which plaster caster is just a name for these creatures that exist within these layers, because while everything's paper mache, they seem to be harder than the environment, making it more like plaster than paper mache, even though they are paper mache, like the rest of the environment. And within this water world, they could only see these flatfish plaster casters, and something called a wake maker plaster caster. Now, the flatfish plaster caster are, as you'd expect, flatfish that instead of swim like you'd expect normal fish to do, or even some normal entities do in this, they worm themselves between the layers by essentially chewing down and then spitting out through their rear, because they exist more like, or chewing down and then spitting out, because they exist more like a coral jellyfish hybrid, where they have one hole to enter, one hole to exit. And they grow themselves by eating things that aren't part of that initial layer, such as, or eating things within that layer. Sorry, my other fan was messing with me. And within that layer, essentially, aside from the flatfish, wake makers were massive creatures that actually killed this greed creature by displacing the very like fabric of this paper mache ocean through the actual hole that was like maybe this big, made by the gnawing of this greed creature. Because wake makers are huge, and they are meant to be, because the niche they fit is the fact that wake makers provide light for most of the entities below, because wake makers act as both whales as well as mass siphonophores that use bioluminescence that they generate through movement and heat to light up the bottom and provide light for a host of algae-like plaster casters and just plant-like plaster casters. They fit that niche. And they immediately set up, because if they let it escape any further, it would have cracked and not only lost the way they could, lost proof that they saw that, because once they sealed up the plaster caster, once you seal up a plaster place after you peel back a layer, it will noticeably be different because it wasn't supposed to be there, because the layers don't change. So like if you pick up part of the ground layer and cover up a layer on a gray, like one of the gray spikes, then that ground layer that was, say, really, really, really light gray will show up very noticeably on the really, really dark gray. So that one in this plaster place, though, not every layer that they peeled back would be the same. The next layer that they peeled back was the inhospitable seeming city. Now, the inhospitable seeming city was noticeably inhospitable because it was they couldn't fit through the holes that they made. It seemed to be a city made entirely out of a stone-like plaster consistency, but they couldn't fit themselves through there to actually see if there was anything in there. So they deemed it uninhabitable because by Satori's own words, the captain said that there was no way that that anything could enter or exit, because any form of entrance that they made would be basically moot. It didn't matter if it existed or not. The next place that they properly visited after they explored the rest of these environments, which consisted of a desert that had nothing in it. It looked like the plains, but with less trees and actual sandstorms that basically created illusions to Satori, but Satori actually see the illusions. Essentially, what's happening is the already oily like air that they see through was just peppered with like flakes upon flakes of this paper mache like plaster that acted like sand. And the next place they peeked into but couldn't really enter because it was actual diplomacy was ironically the amorphous zone, because the amorphous zone was populated by what we would often see as invertebrate like traits, such as jellyfish and like insects, or not insects but like worms. But they had a form of like diplomacy where they wouldn't allow non-plaster like creatures to enter their world because they didn't want to shock a lot of the non-sentient, non-diplomatic creatures. Because a lot of the diplomatic creatures, they weren't diplomatic based off of specifically their species. They were diplomatic because the way this world genetically worked was that certain people or certain amorphous creatures that I will call people on instinct gained sentience based off of just genetics. So for example, you could have a amorphous creature made that looked like a plant that would flow like some form of slime mold, have the same sentience, just limitations, but just different limitations than a worm-like plaster caster. I messed that up. A worm-like amorphous creature. And their philosophy was that certain creatures were easier to anger or scare or kill than others, because while they were all amorphous, they still had limitations biologically. And one of those limitations was that there was a specific species not known to be diplomatic easily that was very akin to soft-shell crab, that when they encountered something new, if they didn't encounter it slow enough because their processing was like a fly, they would scatter. But because their bodies were borderline hard, when they encountered something amorphous, they often just melted and blended into their bodies, and they basically died instantly. And because of that, they often were endangered in their many subspecies, with the exception of one subspecies that was just more commonly sentient, and that was because they were just larger than the rest of the small ones, because they ranged in size from this, which were numerous, to just the size of this book, which were the more endangered species. Now, what Satori learned from these specific people, because Satori was chosen for this mission because of their language acquisition. They could very easily pick up on language because of an ability that they had, because of their own lore, which I will not get into. I've already tangentialized myself enough. But essentially, they picked up on language really quickly just by listening to multiple different spheres of it. So when they heard the amorphous, they basically picked up on their forms of language and expressed that as they would cause ecological damage. So everyone accepted that. The next world they went into was avian, which they could obviously not enter through because they couldn't fly. The next world they went into was inorganic, which they couldn't enter to because they had no way of communicating with the life forms there, because they didn't speak through any form of language. They spoke basically through a hive mind that no one else besides the organics could connect to. The next one was cephalopod, and the only reason why they couldn't enter that world properly was that they walked into it and then they were immediately met with hostility, which was very similar to the insectoid, humanoid, and amphibious worlds. But this hostility was different because it was intentional hostility. They knew that they were dangerous, and this wasn't because they were very intelligent but not sentient like the amorphous, so they immediately tried to fight them. And they didn't want to cause any unnecessary damage because they knew that they could very easily kill these creatures, or they thought they could, hint, hint, if they inhabited this. The humanoid area was called humanoid because they saw humanoid corpses. And it was one of these squad members, which I don't have a name for at the moment because I'm bad with names right now. Because of course, of all things, I don't think of names for human creatures. They said that they didn't want to risk going into this dead, desolate humanoid thing and maybe thinking that it was connected to the city environment they couldn't enter. And maybe the reason why they couldn't enter was that those entrances were blocked off and they were seeing cracks into a dead world. And the insectoid and amphibious areas were basically, I need to move this around, but they basically fought back like they were animals. And that caused not alarm, but that caused essentially stress among, that caused a basically intense stress for the rest of the crew because they didn't expect this to like be this hostile. They didn't expect to actually get into any form of fight via this mission. So because they weren't expecting it, they didn't want to go on the offensive. Yes, they were a squadron very similar to a military, but that doesn't mean they wanted to kill these creatures. But they did manage to be able to explore the jungle. Now, this jungle was massive. This jungle was this entire lair. The entire lair was a jungle. And to specify that, because this entire lair was a jungle, there were every creature that they found in this that they thought they could easily take care of when it was hostile to them, because they almost became trapped for what felt like days, but was really just moments in this lair. When they became trapped in this lair, they thought that they could very easily just escape through. Maybe there was sentience. Nothing in this lair was sentient. They were animals. They were just monstrous animals that were way more unexpected in power and strength than they initially expected. But because the entire lair was a jungle, voice crack, because this entire lair was a jungle, the ecological niches we would see in our jungles, where there was, say, maybe a meadow area with more anteaters like in South America, and then leopards in the jungles, treetops, and then birds. No, this entire place was basically one giant jungle, and there was nothing ecologically that could actually like separate themselves. So you could see the same wolf or gray wolf plaster caster everywhere, and then you would also see the same bald eagle plaster caster. Now, they were given these names not because they were accurate depictions of these animals in our Earth, but they were given these because they often fit the same niche that we would consider them to fit in. For example, the gray wolf plaster casters fit your stereotypical wolf hierarchy. However, or very similarly to the troop structure of many of the howler monkey plaster casters, the silverback gorilla plaster casters, which, funnily enough, the gorilla plaster casters, there's only one species of gorilla in this entire place, so they didn't call it silverback or lowland gorilla. They just called it gorilla plaster casters. In fact, the gorilla plaster casters were what I thought of whenever I had this dream and what led me down this giant rabbit hole. Now, the gorilla plaster casters are the more notable ones because they're the ones that I have mostly drawn, and you can't actively see it because I've sketched it out kind of messily. But the way plaster casters can be accurately, commonly seen across all forms is that their face is usually not asymmetrical or semi-symmetrical, in which when they're split down in half, the only symmetrical part is often just the shape, and usually that's the most like flaccid part of it, where it flops around a bit, but it's often just the shape. And then the facial structure would have like either a mouth underneath the paper or a split where the mouth was everywhere in the paper, like a mouth line here and then here. Or there's, in the case of many of the all the gorilla plaster casters, they have three eyes on the right side of their face, unlike the left side, and then a V-shaped line that flows kind of like a vein in the middle of their face. And often They often this is where they get their actual plaster caster name, because the face is of way lighter consistency, like you're making a plaster cast molding, and it is often seen like a cast that you would get on your arm or your leg, that kind of plaster, but it is still made of the paper mache material. And this was found after the sergeant killed one of these killed one of the troop members that was a scout for this guerrilla plaster caster troop that they encountered. Which I will specify, just because there's guerrilla plaster casters everywhere, that doesn't mean they're all part of the same troop. There's still physical variations aside from the face that exist between all of these creatures, even if they're all mentioned under the same species. For example, a gray wolf plaster caster in one pack could look like more like a gray wolf, while another one could look more like a dire wolf, but still have gray wolf consistencies, just not the dire wolf size. It could look much darker and angrier and have a larger head. And getting that out of the way helps explain a lot more of the creatures that we see, because as soon as they killed this gorilla plaster caster, another form of a gorilla plaster caster came in, and it was a loner type. And it was much more hesitant than the scout plaster caster, because the scouts of some of these troops were a lot more violent because of the area they lived in. But it was also covered in white lines that looked like scars, but they weren't scars. They were aging marks from the fact that, these creatures don't scar. They just heal over with their paper mache like material. But the older they get, the more their paper mache bodies harden to the plaster like consistency on their face. And the more dexterous they become, the more dangerous they become if you provoke them. Now, the thing with this older plaster caster or guerrilla plaster casters, it seemed to be cannibalistic. So whenever they encountered it, it seemed less interested in them and more the corpse that they created. So they all escaped who they had with them, which was Seitori, the unnamed creature or unnamed human, the sergeant of an unknown species. So that's 2 out of the 5 plus the sergeant. A normal sentient gorilla, which is consistent with Amy from Congo, if you've seen that. And that's going to sound really weird, but a Terminator from the Terminator series, the first movie, which, yes, that's in there with the rest of these 3. And another human, but with more, I want to say, immortal features, because it's hard to explain a lot of the immortal creatures in my giant expanded world, because a lot of them are immortal in different ways. This is what you would expect a stereotypical immortal human to look like: shrunken genitals, no hair, like tall, muscular, like focusing more on physical peak, like strength and look, rather than prolonging longevity and just looking like a human. So it was 3 plus the sergeant, who, if the name wasn't like Germanic-ish, but also have that like rough tone, it was a cat person who has a hybrid between a human and a cat, which this entire species of centaur hybrid weird creatures of human and cat have the same kind of like physical features that our own like countries develop themselves, such as certain traits developing in like Aboriginal communities compared to American communities, and vice versa. Certain racial traits and certain physical traits developed through environment. This one was more Germanic traits that you would expect from, well, sadly, it's a sergeant, so my mind immediately went to more stereotypical German soldier, but that doesn't mean it is stereotypical German soldier. It is just stereotypically German traits on a more feline hybrid body. Now, these creatures out a lot to the plaster caster creatures in general, but the old plaster casters that seem to be loners, like the gorilla plaster caster that seem to be cannibalistic, seem to pay less mind to them because they didn't care. But the younger, more like social or more like aggressive plaster casters, such as a Burmese python plaster caster that they encountered much later on in their journey before they actually managed to escape, they seem to be much more offensive and xenophobic, for lack of a better term, to other creatures, because namely later on the sergeant dies, and by the hands of a god, I forget trying to remember it for the eagle plaster caster earlier, but it is, oh god, Philippine eagle. The Philippine eagle plaster caster killed the cat like sergeant of this entire band of misfits, essentially. God, I messed this up horribly, but killed the leader of this group of misfits through hunting, like you would expect, obviously. And sorry, I'm getting really distracted. Uh, through hunting, and essentially, this is where Satori mentions that certain creatures have different like necessities. For example, they met other cannibalistic and much more docile plaster casters. For example, they met a variation of a wake maker plaster caster for a river they found, which they followed, that managed to help them manage to escape. It was way smaller, but was found on the bottom and upside down. Whenever they entered the water and then encountered it, it was more agitated at the fact that it was stepped on rather than the fact that they were new creatures. Because these wake makers still have eyes, so it's not like they were blind to the world because they were just bumbling whale-like creatures. They still have eyes, and they were actually very predatory, but they don't care about larger predators. They care about smaller things that step on them, such as a skidding plaster caster, which are creatures that skid on top that sink below whenever they get killed or get old, and tripod fish plaster casters, which often accidentally walk or swim on top of these wake maker plaster casters and immediately just get wailed on in mass, because tripod plaster casters are very common. Now, going back to the gorilla caster, because that's the one I have physical traits for and can help map out the physical traits of other plaster casters. When you think of gorilla, you think of big hulking beast, dark fur, big head, and like social. While these are still social and still fit that moniker, essentially they have a big upper body and giant forearms and shoulders, but smaller, more nimble lower bodies and legs that seem more like a dog's legs than a gorilla's legs. But they still have a gorilla-like lower jaw and a head crest that is masked by their facial structure, which the plaster caster facial structure. And the gorilla plaster casters are known for not like beating their chest or a wailing cry, but are instead known for basically their face, the front of their face, their lips being much more flaccid than the rest, most plaster casters and the rest of their face. So they flip it up and expose sharp teeth that rest on the bottom and out of their jaws, which their jaws are very bony and often stick out more. And in some like adapted gorilla plaster casters, parts of their jawbones, like down here, are much sharper, or parts up here that lock in the upper jaw are much sharper to act as extra canine teeth. When they encountered another set of plaster casters, this time a whole troop, it was without the commander at the edge of a river. And Satori remarks that out of all the other creatures that I will mention earlier, just not as quickly, because the last people that were there were the human, the immortal human, immortal through age, by the way, if that wasn't obvious. And Satori, out of all of the creatures they met, they were the most hostile, specifically to the more humanoid aspects of them. For example, when Satori pinned down by a juvenile male who seemed to be on the scouting part, or a juvenile what felt like a male, it was actually female. Satori is female if it wasn't more obvious by the first name. But when the female pounced and seemed to be more like aggressive to Satori, it was more aggressive to it seemed angry at the fact that it had hands and a face and just more equal proportions than it did. And the immortal human, who I will now name because I'm finally coming up with a name, Kaijitu, which don't ask where I thought of that name. I think it was because I thought of King Kaijitu. Don't know where that came from. Probably a reference in my head that came out of my ass. But Kaijitu remarked that they seemed almost jealous of these traits. And Satori, thinking back and conversing with Kaijitu more, it seems that a lot of the plaster casters in the jungle world, or at least a lot of the plaster casters that they met and mentioned throughout their entire adventure that they could actually see, do seem more jealous of the fact that their proportions are more even. Because after some like backtracking and thinking and going over with other witnesses, but with Kaijitu, who Satori became really close to after this adventure, obviously your entire squad died, including your command or your sergeant. Of course, you would get close to the last survivor. Not lovingly close, because obviously Kaijitu isn't there for love. He's there for getting strong and fighting, even though I did my shitty Arnold voice for Kaijitu and not the Terminator. But I digress. They mentioned that a lot of the creatures there, including some of the ones that mention, like even the gorilla one, for example, all of the creatures in plaster casters that they met that mimicked living creatures from like Satori's world, because Satori, even though it had or he had an or god damn it, even though she had an ability, she was still mostly human by our standards, like indistinguishable between us, with the exception of maybe her ability gave her a larger throat or a deeper voice at times, or her accent was harder to place. But that was just because of her ability. She was human by that standard. So they remarked after thinking with Kaijitu that a lot of even the amorphous creatures seemed almost jealous or kind of wary of their physical traits, not them specifically, because they mentioned that a lot of creatures in this entire liminal phenomenon world that they mentioned that didn't have proportional features. For example, wake makers look like masses of like algae that have misplaced like teeth, and in general just look like someone took a bug and went and slapped on it and spread it across and just like let algae grow on like parts of it. And they remarked that they didn't seem like they were angry at the fact that they were like human or foreign. In fact, they witnessed a tripod plaster caster actually fly out of the water, and a Burmese python plaster caster that they saw their last like thing actually nudge it back into the water. They seem more sympathetic to their own kind, but that things that seem more proportional, things that seem more normal in their own physical features, were more prejudiced against, almost as if they were jealous, because after they went back, because they had to go back like out of confusion, after they went back to witness, like to find their sergeant, to get something from the sergeant that they realized that they needed, they realized that the sergeant wasn't eaten, or the sergeant wasn't like killed and then left there to die. The sergeant was brutalized like you would see someone brutalize someone with a bat in a manic drug-induced rage. They seemed like pissed at the sergeant, because even though the sergeant was like a cat centaur hybrid thing, the sergeant was like still proportional. It still had like normal proportions. Its arms were the same. Its legs were the same. So it was beaten to death to look almost like a plaster caster. So finally, when they left this world, I go into some of the other creatures that they saw and describe some of the other creatures that they saw. When they finally left this world, or left that lair, and then were able to leave this world, and Satori was making this archive, they came back they managed to talk to a version of Van Gogh who actually, like, because the way, I'm going to mention this really quickly, the way multiverse works is that there is a big explosion of just things, but also linear paths that like stretch out, kind of like branching worlds, like that branching worlds theory instead of the multiverse theory. So two Van Goghs can exist in the exact same world and just make different mistakes, and they're just in different timelines. They can even visit the same world just at different times or in different timeline forms. While that can be confusing, that kind of is explained through other means that I'm not going to go here. So they managed to talk to another version of Van Gogh that actually visited the same world, but survived and actually visited a different realm managed to get into the humanoid realm. And they said that this version of Van Gogh said that he saw, even though he couldn't see much, from what he saw from images in the humanoid world, which he did confirm was different from the untouchable city. It's completely different from the untouchable city, and it was actually not uninhabitable. Not the untouchable city, that was still deemed uninhabitable, but the humanoid realm was not uninhabitable. Most of the humans were dead because it was a warfaring society because of this very phenomena of, or this very thought process of proportion. Van Gogh saw that these plaster casters, even in images and like paintings, both old and new, they hated people or hated other plaster casters, even other species and like of their same species that had more proportional features than each other. Because in plaster caster, like in this world, essentially, as I mentioned before, everything looked like an oil painting. So there was that really hazy mark. When you're proportional, you're like in the hazy mark, you stand out more. You actually fit better more in the haze than you do if you're amorphous. For example, Van Gogh said because he was so adept at oil painting, he could actually separate mentally, like mentally close his eyes and like separate the different ways he could see things within this like oil painting kind of like aesthetic. And he saw that, or he saw something that a much kinder plaster caster, but still angry plaster caster at him mentioned. It was humanoid too, mentioned that when you're disproportionate in an oily pastel feature, you basically don't stand out as much because everyone looks kind of the same. Sometimes when you walk past someone like this, because you're disproportionate and in this oily pastel filter, you kind of look the same. So there's less animosity because there's not enough focus on image. However, if you're more proportional, like say you're a humanoid plaster caster with a big disproportionate gut and legs, but your arms and upper body and your head were more proportional, your lower body doesn't stand out as much because it blends in with, say, the ground or shorter people, but your upper body blends in a lot. In fact, it stands out and it is an eyesore to some people, or it can even be a traffic hazard in, say, the humanoid world, where they do have vehicles that accommodate their more outrageous physiques. And you become an eyesore because even though like you're more physically like say fit, not fit, you immediately still stand out more and you can become a distraction. In some places, like say the places where the distraction is more just common, or the distraction is like the society's more modern, you get people like the person Van Gogh talked to, where they're just more angry at it or more distasteful or distrustful at it. While in some places like the jungle world, where these animals don't have that developed society, they physically just hate looking at something that is like so like disproportionately proportional to them, because it looks like something that could be better than them. It looks like something that could perform better than them in the natural society. So they try to kill it. They brutalize it because an innate hatred has formed over years to kill those things. It's why you don't see a lot of proportional creatures in Satori's description of what they saw. For example, they saw mosquito plaster casters who looked like someone beat a mosquito against a wall. And then they saw the Burmese python plaster caster that looked like, in lack of a better term, a really misshapen butt plug. Like it was strung out and plump in some places, but not in others, and was still eating in some places, and its face was just weird. And everything looked different because ecologically speaking, looking proportional was being beaten out of that niche. Not all places did that, like the humanoid place or the amorphous place, which the amorphous place is special because if you're proportional, that only shows up if you're not keeping your form, where your natural state is just like, say you're an amorphous humanoid, like you're made of a gel-based like human cadaver replica. You can move your body as you move, and it's disproportionate, like every other amorphous creature. But when you stop moving and just sit, you look humanoid. Even then, like, they don't like that, but it's less animosity and more accepted. Everyone else is kind of amorphous. But I digress. In places like the humanoid, where it was beaten out by some cultures, or inorganic, where literally you cannot exist there if you are proportional. Well, it tastes like blood. Sorry if that was gross. It just tasted like metal. Anyway, side tangent aside, essentially, ecologically speaking, that was beaten to hell genetically out of these creatures. So they began to view opposition as something that they should destroy, not just contain or eat. Because in some species in these worlds, if they just eat something and then they excrete it, some creatures, when they're excreted, spawn. For example, wake makers, their young exist off that because their young have a metamorphic kind of lifestyle like frogs, except instead of tadpoles, they're like little pebbles that are almost designed to look structured and proportional, so that when they're eaten, their physical form is adapted to different stressors that wouldn't be in their normal environment, so they can more easily adapt to their environment around them, because they function, again, remember, like more like algae or a squished bug, where they are actually more fluid and flappy than you'd expect. So in those cases, essentially, Satori remarks, going back to Satori and Kaijitu, they remark that it seems that certain traits by specific species as well were focused on more than others. For example, gorilla plaster casters focused on the face and the arms, because that's places that gorilla plaster casters are the most like deficient on in terms of what they look like, similar to our creatures. Meta wise, that's because I made it like that for easier in my head, but lore wise, that essentially means that they bred themselves for traits like their flapping up plaster faces and their thicker arms to be slightly more proportional than the rest of their body, to be more beneficial to like their environment and what they do, which in the gorilla plastercaster's case is beat the fuck out of trees and eat things. Eat heavy plant material like actual gorillas who eat leaves. Surprisingly, if you didn't know that, they eat basically just leaves. I still find really funny, but I digress. Isn't he shit? I'm making a bad decision. Anyway, essentially, they remark that certain traits by certain species are hated more by others. And this was best seen in kind of like the pack mentality creatures that I mentioned before, like the gorilla plastercasters, as well as the gray wolf plastercasters and some other feline plastercasters, such as the Indian lion plastercaster and the African elephant plastercaster, to name a few obvious examples, like of just like different species. They focused primarily on traits that their species was like specifically wanting to have like a dominance over. For example, with the African elephant plastercasters, it was their, as you would expect, an elephant creature to have a tusk-like preference. Because the plaster cast is often their face, they designed like over millions, even longer than like elephants took to exist, millions upon billions of years to exist exclusively with a plaster cast along their trunk. They have no face. They have ears that are glued to their major body, but their trunk and their legs, which are about as long as their trunk, make them look like trees, almost walking trees. They're actually really fast, surprisingly. Lore tidbit, they want to have specifically longer legs and longer faces, even if they're not proportional. So if they saw a, say, human or some humanoid creature, they would witness the proportions of their legs and arms and maybe even how normal their nose looks and get angry at that rather than just angry at the fact that their whole body is proportional. There are a few exceptions to this. For example, any avian plaster casters within like this jungle, because humanoids don't often have wings, they don't often just target humans because they're jealous. They often target humans because they're jealous of what they can do. For example, in the avian world, they just fall infinitely and die of starvation or insanity, while in the jungle world or lair, they essentially, such as the Philippine eagle plaster caster, the crow plaster caster, the crane plaster caster, the shoebill stork plaster caster, and many other birds, even if they're not even like specifically birds that like live in flocks or something, they specifically go after, even though humans don't have wings, and often humans don't have long legs, they don't just target the legs. They often target humans for their like faces and their teeth, because birds have beaks, and many, but not all, avian plaster casters have developed much more hardened plaster cast faces that look like teeth because of how they harden, because it's still a plaster, like, because this, you remember, paper mache everything almost. They still hardened it to look like teeth or spikes or some form of like hook, but they're still not even like human teeth. They're not often like specialized. So they get anxious or they get jealous almost of like teeth or teeth-like creatures. And this even extends to other plaster casts, because some plaster casts, like the gorilla plaster casters, do have more uniform teeth, because sometimes in like some traits in any animal are like almost universal. Like teeth are a very universal thing for a lot of these mammalian plaster casts, and as such, out of often any bird plaster cast often fights another plaster cast because they look like they have uniform teeth. They often don't do it to reptilian plaster casts, specifically snake plaster casts, because, as I mentioned before, the Burmese python plaster cast, as it was described by Satori, was like very just, someone took a butt plug or a rope and just like knotted it up and messed it up and frayed out the teeth or face. Now, I mentioned a lot of animals there that aren't just have more lore significance, but a lot of these animals were seen by Satori and the rest of Satori's like crew, specifically Satori, because Satori was just one of the last survivors, and King Kaijitu, because Kaijitu was one of the taller ones there. He could see a bit more than the others. That's mainly just out of height advantage and having good eyes, because he trained his eyes as an immortal humanoid. But they both remarked that there were a multitude of different creatures, both familiar to them, such as the birds they described, the reptiles they described, the mosquitoes they described, the fish they described, and then things they weren't very just attuned with. For example, they weren't very attuned with, if it wasn't obvious enough, they weren't very attuned with wake maker plaster casters. They also had flesh spinning webbing plaster casters. Now, those were very intently described by Satori, because Satori is afraid of spiders, except flesh spinning webbing plaster casters, while they sound like they would be spiders or spider adjacent, have nothing to do with spiders, and were given this name because they somehow still invoked the same arachnophobia within Satori. Flesh spinning webbing plaster casters are very weird creatures that look like lumpy balls, rocks that sit on the ground, that have like a plaster cast, usually of one shape and eye. However, when you mess with it, or you like attempt to look at it or pick it up, flesh spinning plaster casters can unwind their entire body cellularly to create thin, almost microscopic strands that look kind of like spiders, but can be best described as those swimming, like, I think they're called false starfish, that they exist in a lot of worlds because their bodies can be squished and flattened and spun, hence flesh spinning webbing plaster casters, but often seen in the aquatic or amphibious, ocean, and jungle plaster casts because they often make themselves bigger and longer by just cellularly destroying anything they come in contact with. And usually that is another plaster cast. But if they encounter a human, like the like the normal human that was actually a member, I think I mentioned that. If not, there is a normal human. Actually, no, I just realized that I made a mistake. They actually did come into contact with Satori. That's where I was messing up, because Satori didn't die from this encounter or lose anything in this encounter, but almost did, because way they work is that if they spot or you spot it and it chooses you as a target, and you're, say, a human or something made of flesh and not made of this paper mache material, is because you are made of this flesh-like material, they have a preference or a tendency to just try to unspin you like they unspin it. And this is a very painful process that they end up doing and looking like a spider. In fact, the bite mark and scar does look like a spider bite, hence why in specifically the memory of the plaster caster or web spinning or flesh spinning webbing plaster caster, Satori gets arachnophobia like chills. There is also one last plaster caster I have yet to mention that was not actually seen by Satori but was instead documented by, specifically mentioned by Kaijitu, hearsay from the last words of the Greed member of the team, who, if you remember, was crushed by the immense pressure of the ocean area, because something within that pressure did fight, try to escape. And that was what was called by Kaijitu the Russian plaster caster. The Russian plaster caster is as Kaijitu described it from the gluttonous, I think I said greed earlier, gluttonous member of the team, as what almost looked humanoid creature. It almost looked humanoid, with the exception of appearing as though it was made of ice and snow and a human trapped in permafrost. But it also looked flattened and almost as if it floated across the layers of the ocean as a flattened, crushed permafrost creature. But when it tries to go on the attack, it turns its body, and that's when you see its plaster cast face, which is that its entire body is the reason why it is a plaster cast face. It looks as though it is made, because the plaster casts are usually white and asymmetrical, they look almost like they're made of ice and snow. So they're nicknamed Russian plaster casters because Kaijitu, in his more or less just mentioned lore, is from an icy and snowy area of Belarus, not Russia specifically, but not Russia specifically because in his world, while it was still our world, there are still differences in countries. Specifically, Russia is hundreds of times smaller than it actually is, and the Mongol Empire is still around, which, wrap your head around that if you want, considering people are now immortal through aging. Genghis Khan gets around, if you know what I mean. Side tangent aside, and I realize that I basically exhausted all I can of this one plastercaster thing. I will be drawing more, but Satori's final remarks in this archive is that the AI that is actually sending out these operations is actually sending out someone who is immune to the plastercaster effects, but only one person, not a squad. Satori, though, does not know who that could be, as all the people she's talked to, Kaijitu, Van Gogh, Eisenhower, but not Dwight D. Eisenhower, who's a key witness, but someone who is named Eisenhower, who is a transformer, ironically, not like a Cybertronian transformer, but like a form of transformer that is just a fucking ship. You as Zerlane fans, which yes, I'm a degenerate that knows what that is, and I hate it. I hate the jiggle physics. I hate it. My sexuality's kicking in. Anyway, it is basically a human that can turn into a boat. It is more akin to that one dinosaur plane anime obscure thing where the dinosaurs just came out of the planes, essentially. Eisenhower, they are not Satori's like best guy friend, for lack of a better term. That would be given to Kaijitu. But Eisenhower is like an informant because even though the AI is not like all powerful, it has a preference for the more mechanical or the more analytical. So Kaijitu and Eisenhower are actually more preferred to be not sent out by missions, but more spared to be sent out by missions that were already traumatic. That fucking God, that unlike the more human and emotional Satori. So I'm going to stop. It has been 1 hour and 6 minutes and counting. God, I'm getting slightly hungry. I need to eat food because it is 10:44. But I hope you enjoyed this rambling. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments of the stream. I will hopefully be able to answer them. I don't get many comments and views, and that's fine. I don't care because I like getting my ideas out, and it doesn't matter if people watch or not or just comment to comment. Hopefully you enjoyed. If you just play this in the background, heard a schizo rant, I don't care. I'm just glad you're here. Even though no one was here for the stream, this was just an easier way to make a video that wouldn't take up space on my laptop. I hope. Because sometimes I'm bad at downloading things. But hopefully you enjoy, and I will see you later. God damn it. Oh, God.